The deafening roar of 2,000 horsepower cut through the morning air over the Pacific as Lieutenant Alex Vraciu adjusted the controls of his F6F Hellcat, unaware that in less than 8 minutes he would star in what historians would call the most devastating aerial massacre of World War II. It was June 19, 1944, and what began as another routine patrol over Task Force 58 would transform into the epitaph of Japanese naval aviation. In just 6 bursts from his 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, Vraciu would shoot down 6 Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers in sequence, a feat that perfectly symbolized the brutal efficiency of a war machine that was rewriting the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. The heated metal of the Pratt & Whitney R2810W engine cowling radiated heat waves that distorted vision, while the characteristic smell of aviation oil and exhaust gases mingled with the salty ocean breeze. Vraciu could feel the powerful vibration of the 18 double-row cylinders through the seat of his armored cockpit, a sensation that had become familiar after hundreds of hours of flight, but which still impressed him with the raw power he commanded. The Hellcat was not only superior to the Zero in top speed, 605 km/h versus 533 km/h, but represented a completely different philosophy of aerial combat, where pilot survival and the ability to absorb damage were as important as agility. But how did an aircraft that many considered just a robust fighter manage not only to match, but completely dominate the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, the machine that had humiliated Allied forces at Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific in a matter of months? The answer was hidden in seemingly mundane technical details: self-sealing fuel tanks, strategically placed armor, and a fire control system that turned average pilots into lethal aces. Even more intriguing was the fact that the Japanese themselves had, unwittingly, provided the exact specifications for their own defeat. What Japanese strategists failed to understand was that they were witnessing not just the superiority of an aircraft, but the physical manifestation of 2 completely opposing industrial and military philosophies colliding in the Pacific skies. While the Zero represented the deadly elegance of Japanese engineering, light, agile, but fatally vulnerable, the Hellcat embodied the American approach: brute force, maximum protection, and mass production. This would not just be a battle between pilots, but between 2 worldviews on how to win a war. The story of the F6F Hellcat began almost ironically in a boardroom at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, where American engineers meticulously studied the wreckage of a Zero captured in the Aleutian Islands. It was September 1942, and the Akutan Zero, as the damaged A6M2 Model 21, forced to land on Akutan Island became known, was being disassembled screw by screw by the best aeronautical experts in the United States. The irony was that the Japanese, in their pursuit of technical perfection, had created their own downfall by allowing the Americans to discover exactly how to defeat them. Roy Grumman and his engineers wasted no time romanticizing the Zero's elegance. They coldly identified its fundamental weaknesses: an extremely light structure that disintegrated under heavy fire, unprotected fuel tanks that exploded easily, and a complete absence of pilot armor. The metallic clang of hammers echoed through the hangar as technicians tested the resistance of the Zero's fuselage, discovering that some sections could literally be punctured with a screwdriver. "It's as if they built a work of art to die," commented Chief Engineer William Schwendler upon observing the almost artisanal construction of the Japanese aircraft. The American response would be diametrically opposite. The F6F Hellcat, which first flew on June 26, 1942, weighed 4,190 kilobits fully loaded, almost double the Zero's 2,810 kilobits. But this extra mass was not waste, it was calculated protection. Every additional kilogram represented 6.35 mm steel armor protecting vital points. Goodyear developed self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb multiple impacts without exploding, and a robust structure capable of returning to base even after absorbing damage that would completely destroy a Zero. The contrast was brutal. Where the Zero sacrificed everything for agility, the Hellcat sacrificed agility for survival. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was a masterpiece of American engineering, generating 2,000 horsepower through 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. Compared to the Zero's 940 horsepower Nakajima NK-1C Sakai, the American engine was not just more powerful, it was a declaration of industrial war. While Japan struggled to produce reliable engines in sufficient quantities, Pratt & Whitney was manufacturing R-2800s on a production line that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The difference was not just in power, but in replacement capacity. For every Japanese engine lost, the Americans could produce 5. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Hellcat was something that could not be seen or touched: its combat philosophy. While Japanese pilots were trained for prolonged aerial duels, taking advantage of the Zero's superior maneuverability, Hellcat pilots learned completely different tactics. Boom and zoom became the mantra. Dive at high speed, attack with all 650 caliber machine guns, and use superior speed to escape before the enemy could react. It was an approach that transformed aerial combat from a deadly dance into an industrial execution. The first indication that something had fundamentally changed in the Pacific's aerial power balance came on August 31, 1943, during Operation Cartwheel, when F6F squadrons from the USS Yorktown and USS Independence intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers over Marcus Island. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, already an ace with 8 victories in F4F Wildcats, was leading his first combat mission in a Hellcat when he spotted 18 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by 12 Zeros approaching the American task force. What happened in the next 12 minutes would be studied in military academies for decades. The roar of the R-2800 engines at combat power created a deafening symphony as 16 Hellcats dove from 7,000 meters towards the Japanese formation. O'Hare could feel the acceleration pressing his body against the armored seat as the speedometer read 650 km/h, a speed no Zero could match in a dive. The tactic was simple and brutal. Attack the bombers first, ignore the escort fighters, and use superior speed to avoid prolonged combat. It was exactly the opposite of everything the Japanese expected from aerial combat. O'Hare's Hellcats, 6 Browning M2 machine guns, spat out 4,800 rounds per minute as he opened fire on the first Betty 400 meters away. The sound was like a giant zipper being opened, but amplified 1,000 times. Unlike the Zero's 7.7mm machine guns, the American 50 caliber projectiles had devastating stopping power. Each impact was capable of tearing significant chunks from the bomber's structure. The first Betty exploded in an orange fireball that O'Hare had to swerve to avoid, while fragments of hot metal ricocheted off his armored cockpit windshield. In less than 2 minutes, 8 of the 18 Japanese bombers had been shot down, and the escorting Zeros were still trying to catch up with the Hellcats, which had already gained altitude again. The frustration of the Japanese pilots was palpable through later translated radio intercepts. "Too fast? We can't catch them? How can they climb so fast?" Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of the Imperial Navy's most experienced aces, would later report that it was the first time he felt completely helpless in aerial combat. "It was like trying to hunt hawks with butterflies," he wrote in his diary. The final outcome of the battle over Marcus Island was devastating for the Japanese. 16 aircraft lost, 8 bombers and 8 fighters, against only 1 damaged Hellcat that managed to return to the aircraft carrier. More important than the numbers, however, was the psychological message. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, veteran Japanese pilots were returning to base with reports of an American aircraft that not only matched them, but surpassed them in almost every aspect of aerial combat. The invincibility of the Zero, built through 2 years of consecutive victories, began to crack. The true test of the F6F Hellcat would come during Operation Forager, the American invasion of the Mariana Islands in June 1944. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific, 15 aircraft carriers carrying 956 aircraft, of which 475 were F6F Hellcats. On the Japanese side, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the mobile fleet with 9 aircraft carriers and 473 aircraft, including the newest A6M5 Zeros and D4Y Judy dive bombers. It was the definitive confrontation between 2 philosophies of aerial warfare, and the whole world watched. The morning of June 19, 1944, dawned clear over the Philippine Sea, with 15-knot winds from the east, perfect conditions for carrier operations. In the hangars of the American ships, the smell of 100-octane aviation fuel mingled with the oil of the R-2800 engines as hundreds of mechanics performed final checks on the Hellcats. Each aircraft carried $2,400, 50 caliber rounds and full tanks with 946 liters of fuel, enough ammunition and endurance for a prolonged battle. The contrast with Japanese preparations was striking. many Zero pilots would fly with only 200 rounds per machine gun, a limitation that reflected Japan's growing resource scarcity. At 10:04 a.m., American radars detected the first wave of Japanese attack, 69 aircraft approaching at 24,000 feet altitude. Commander David McCampbell, leader of Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, led 36 Hellcats in interception. What followed was described by witnesses as the greatest aerial massacre in naval history. The Hellcats, flying in formations of 4 aircraft, attacked the Japanese formations with surgical precision. McCampbell personally shot down 7 aircraft in a single mission, setting a record that stands to this day. The Hellcats' technical superiority manifested in every aspect of combat. While Zero struggled to maintain speed at altitude, the Hellcats' R-2800 engines maintained full power up to 7,000 meters. The difference was deadly. Japanese pilots reported that their engines sputtered and lost power precisely when they needed it most, while the Americans maintained a speed and climb rate advantage at any altitude. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a veteran with 13 victories, wrote in his last report, "It's like fighting mechanical demons. They appear out of nowhere, attack with devastating fire, and disappear before we can react." By the end of the day that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the numbers were simply incomprehensible by the aerial combat standards of the time. 476 Japanese aircraft shot down against only 29 American losses. Even more shocking was the composition of American losses. Only 6 Hellcats were shot down in aerial combat, while the other 23 lost aircraft were bombers and torpedo planes shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. The F6F's kill ratio that day was 79.1, a number so extreme that many historians initially considered it a documentation error. Post-combat analysis revealed even more impressive aspects of the Hellcat's superiority. Of the 6 F6Fs shot down in aerial combat during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 4 pilots were rescued alive, a 67% survival rate that contrasted brutally with the Japanese rate of less than 10%. The difference lay in seemingly mundane details. The Hellcat's armored seat protected the pilot's spine, self-sealing tanks prevented catastrophic explosions, and the robust structure allowed the aircraft to continue flying even after absorbing damage that would destroy a Zero. Lieutenant Hamilton McWhorter, who survived after being shot down by 3 Zeros simultaneously, described his experience. "I felt the impacts like hammers hitting the fuselage. The windshield shattered, the engine started leaking oil, and I could see holes in the right wing large enough to put my fist through. But the Hellcat kept flying. I managed to glide for 15 kilometers to an American destroyer." When divers examined the wreckage of his F6F at the bottom of the ocean years later, they found evidence of 47 Japanese projectile impacts, damage that would have instantly disintegrated any Zero. The Hellcat's robustness was not accidental, but the result of a revolutionary design philosophy. While Japanese engineers sought perfection through weight reduction, Americans embraced the concept of protective redundancy. Every vital system had backup: 2 independent hydraulic systems, duplicated electrical wiring, and even alternative flight controls in case the primary ones were damaged. It was total war engineering, where the survival of the machine and the pilot was more important than technical elegance. Japanese intelligence reports captured after the war revealed the devastating psychological impact the Hellcat was having on their pilots. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, wrote in a confidential memo, "Our pilots are losing confidence. They report that American fighters are indestructible and that our projectiles have no effect. This is obviously an exaggeration born of fear, but the impact on morale is real and dangerous." What Genda didn't know was that his pilots were literally accurate. The Zero's 7.7mm projectiles indeed had difficulty penetrating the Hellcat's armor. Even more revealing was the change in Japanese tactics. Intercepted documents showed explicit orders to avoid direct combat with F6Fs whenever possible, prioritizing attacks on American bombers and torpedo planes. It was a tacit admission that the Zero had lost its aerial supremacy. Admiral Ozawa went so far as to suggest that Japanese pilots should accept the loss of some enemy bombers if it meant avoiding confrontation with the Hellcats. It was a complete reversal of Japanese doctrine, which had always prioritized the destruction of enemy fighters first. The strategic impact of the F6F Hellcat's dominance extended far beyond aerial combat statistics. With air superiority firmly established, American amphibious operations in the Pacific became exponentially more effective. The invasion of Saipan, which Japanese planners expected to last months, was completed in just 25 days, largely due to the inability of Japanese aviation to interfere with landing operations. Hellcats not only dominated the air, but also proved devastatingly effective in ground attacks, their 650 caliber machine guns capable of destroying light tanks and fortified positions. American industrial production was peaking in 1944, with Grumman producing 605 F6Fs per month at the Bethpage factory. It was a production rate that Japan simply could not match. While Americans produced one Hellcat every 78 minutes, the Japanese took an entire week to complete a zero. Even more critical was the quality of the pilots. The United States was graduating 2,000 naval pilots per month from its flight schools, while Japan could barely replace losses with 200 monthly pilots, many with inadequate training due to fuel and training aircraft shortages. Lieutenant Commander John Thasch, creator of the famous Thatch Weave tactics, observed a fundamental change in the behavior of Japanese pilots during the August 1944 battles. They no longer fight as before. I see hesitation, defensive movements, attempts to escape. The same pilots who were aggressive and determined in 1942 now seem to be just trying to survive. It was a prophetic observation. The elite of Japanese naval aviation, forged through years of intensive training and combat experience, was being systematically eliminated by the Hellcats, and there were no adequately trained reserves to replace them. Japanese radio intercepts translated by American intelligence revealed growing desperation. In a particularly revealing transmission from September 1944, a Japanese pilot was heard screaming, "There are too many! Too fast! We can't! We can't!" before the transmission was abruptly cut off. Later analysis showed that this transmission came from a combat where 12 Zeros tried to intercept 4 Hellcats attacking a Japanese convoy. All 12 Zeros were shot down. The 4 Hellcats returned undamaged. The F6F's superiority was forcing desperate changes in Japanese strategy. Captured documents revealed plans for the development of special attack tactics, a euphemism for kamikaze suicide missions. It was an implicit admission that conventional aerial combat had become impossible against the Hellcats. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, creator of kamikaze tactics, wrote in his diary, "If we cannot win in the air, we must turn our pilots into guided projectiles. It is our only hope against American technical superiority." It was the epitaph of Japanese fighter aviation in the Pacific. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, F6F Hellcats had accumulated statistics that would forever redefine the concept of air superiority. In 66, 530 combat missions, Hellcat pilots claimed 5,163 aerial victories, representing 56% of all American naval aviation victories in World War II. With only 270 Hellcats lost in aerial combat, the final kill ratio was 19.1.1, a number that remains unmatched in the history of military aviation. But the numbers, however impressive, told only part of the story. The true legacy of the F6F Hellcat lay in the fundamental transformation it brought about in aerial combat doctrine. The era of chivalrous aerial duels, where individual skill and aircraft agility determined the victor, had ended. In its place emerged a new reality where technical superiority, pilot protection, and industrial production capacity were the decisive factors. It was a lesson that would echo through the Korean War, Vietnam, and all subsequent aerial conflicts. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Forces, summarized the Hellcat's impact in a phrase that would become legendary. The F6F not only won the air war in the Pacific, it redefined it. It was an accurate assessment. The Hellcat had proven that modern warfare was not won by technical elegance or military tradition, but by the ability to combine technological innovation with mass production and tactics adapted to the industrial reality of the 20th century. For the Japanese, the legacy was darker. The destruction of their elite naval pilots by the Hellcats created a vacuum of experience that could never be filled. The kamikaze pilots who attacked the American fleet in 1945 were, for the most part, young men with less than 50 hours of flight, a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. It was the direct consequence of the 19:1 kill ratio that had systematically decimated the instructors and veterans who could have trained the next generation. Today, when modern fighter pilots study aerial combat tactics, they inevitably encounter the lessons of the F6F Hellcat. That survival is more important than agility, that pilot protection is a force multiplier, and that technological superiority combined with mass production can overcome any temporary tactical advantage. The roar of the R2800 engine may have silenced decades ago, but its lesson still echoes in skies around the world today. In modern warfare, victory goes to those who best combine innovation with industrial capacity, not to those who fly with the most elegance.